Ever contemplated what surgical procedures were like prior to pain relief, before a brilliant mind finally suggested, perhaps we should render individuals unconscious before incisions? Medieval surgery was essentially a spectacle of horror, where merely surviving was considered a noteworthy success. In medieval times, surgical interventions weren't solely medical procedures. They were akin to highly anticipated public events. People would actually form queues to witness procedures like limb amputations or tumor removals. One might surmise that in the absence of modern entertainment like streaming services, public suffering provided a form of spectacle. Medieval surgery was approximately as pleasant as being struck by a horse-drawn carriage on 2 separate occasions. These medical practitioners possessed absolutely no understanding of fundamental concepts we take for granted today. They were unaware of nerve endings, which meant they couldn't comprehend why patients continued to scream when knives were inserted into them. Shocking, isn't it? And let's not even begin to discuss hygiene. Their concept of sterilizing equipment involved a cursory wipe on their likely unwashed garments. Here is a fact that will make you appreciate modern medicine. Around 80% of medieval surgery patients died not from the surgical procedure itself, but from subsequent infections. These surgeons would operate with the same unwashed instruments used on their preceding 10 patients, while wearing clothing that hadn't seen soap since the last crusade. It was as if they were running a buy one surgery, get one infection-free special offer. Remarkably, some medieval surgeons achieved celebrity status. I'm not being facetious. People would journey for days specifically to undergo a surgical procedure performed by a particular renowned surgeon. It was akin to medieval influencer culture, except instead of promoting beauty products, these individuals promoted their ability to amputate a limb in under a minute. Some patients would literally pay extra for the privilege of being operated on by a specific surgeon, even though their chances of survival were roughly equivalent to defeating a dragon in a sword fight. And speaking of survival, you might expect these medieval medical practitioners would at least attempt to alleviate their patients' pain. Well, they did try, to a degree. Some of their methods for pain relief were so unconventional, they seem almost fabricated. For instance, the discovery that partially freezing someone to the point of near death might actually reduce pain. They stumbled upon the fact that extreme cold could offer pain relief, though describing it as a discovery might be overly generous. It was more akin to observing, hey, this soldier who's been lying in the snow for 6 hours isn't screaming as much when we cut off his leg. The whole thing originated with battlefield surgeons who had no alternative but to perform procedures in dreadful conditions. Picture this unfortunate doctor, likely swathed in 6 layers of wool, given medieval fashion's penchant for layering, attempting to save soldiers amidst a winter battle. They began noticing something peculiar. Soldiers who had been lying in the snow for hours were considerably easier to operate on. This wasn't due to exceptional bravery or toughness, but because their limbs were essentially frozen solid. Fun fact, 13th century records indicate one particularly ingenious surgeon named Heinrich von Furten actually wrote about packing wounds with snow before operations. He was essentially the medieval equivalent of an ice pack enthusiast. Got a broken arm? Apply snow. Need your foot amputated? More snow. Wife complaining about your surgical obsession? You guessed it, snow. But here's where things get truly intriguing. These medieval doctors had absolutely no concept of how long they could safely leave body parts in ice or snow. They were essentially engaged in a very dangerous game of frozen limb roulette. Insufficient time in the cold, and the patient would experience everything. Too much time, and suddenly you're dealing with frostbite on top of the original injury. There's a humorous account from a 14th century monastery where a monk surgeon attempted to numb a patient's arm by burying it in snow overnight before surgery. The good news? The patient felt no pain during the operation. The bad news? That's because the arm was completely frozen and required amputation anyway. Talk about solving one problem by creating an even bigger one. Some surgeons became remarkably inventive with their cold therapy techniques. They would create ice packs using whatever was available: snow, crushed ice, or even cold river stones. One particularly resourceful doctor in northern France gained renown for his special numbing method, which essentially involved having his patients stand waist-deep in a freezing river before surgery. His success rate wasn't outstanding, but at least his patients were exceptionally well preserved. The truly ambitious surgeons attempted to combine cold therapy with other pain relief methods. My personal favorite is the story of a German surgeon who would first have his patients sit in the snow, then offer them strong ale to drink. His theory was that the cold would numb their bodies while the ale would numb their minds. Surprisingly, this wasn't the worst idea they came up with, though it did result in many intoxicated frozen patients who couldn't feel their toes but were somehow still coherent enough to complain about it. The most entertaining and slightly terrifying records come from a Norwegian surgeon who specialized in what he called winter operations. He would only perform surgeries on the coldest days of the year, making his patients lie in the snowbanks until their teeth stopped chattering. According to his notes, this was because a patient who cannot feel their own face likely won't feel the knife either. Medieval medical logic at its finest. He even developed a reputation as the ice doctor and refused to operate unless the temperature was below freezing. The fundamental problem wasn't just the cold itself, it was the medieval doctors' complete lack of understanding of how the human body functions. They had no concept of circulation, frostbite, or why turning someone into a human popsicle might not be the optimal medical practice. Some even believed that if a limb was sufficiently cold, it would simply detach naturally, thus avoiding the need for amputation. Spoiler alert, that's not how it works. One particularly misguided surgeon wrote that, "The colder the limb, the cleaner it separates, as if human bodies behave like frozen chicken wings." There were always those patients who simply couldn't tolerate the cold treatment. They would start moving around and trying to warm themselves, which entirely defeated the purpose. This led some surgeons to adopt a different approach, one involving more force and significantly less finesse. When freezing a patient wasn't a viable option, medieval doctors resorted to what I like to call the bite down and pray method. It was exactly as unsophisticated as it sounds. Patients were given something to bite on, usually a piece of wood, leather, or rope, and instructed to hold on for dear life. It was essentially the medieval version of take 2 aspirin and call me in the morning, except instead of aspirin, you got a stick. And instead of calling in the morning, you might not survive until morning. The selection of what to bite down on was actually quite important. Wealthy patients received elaborate leather straps, sometimes even adorned with gold thread, because nothing quite signals affluence like a designer mouthguard while undergoing limb amputation. Impoverished individuals had to make do with whatever was readily available. Actual records exist of surgeons grabbing branches from nearby trees or tearing strips off their own belts when they forgot to bring proper biting materials. One surgeon even gained fame for his emergency kit, which consisted solely of a collection of sticks of varying sizes that he had gathered from his garden. Here's a statistic that will make your dentist cringe. Approximately 60% of surgery patients who use the bite-down method ended up with broken teeth. It turns out that when experiencing the worst pain of your life, you tend to bite down with considerable force. Medieval dentists earned a decent living simply repairing the teeth shattered during surgeries. It was like a 2-for-1 deal. Get your tumor removed and receive some dental work, whether you wanted it or not. Some clever dentists even set up shop outside surgery rooms, soliciting business from waiting family members. Some surgeons became creative with their bite-down implements. One French doctor gained renown for his special comfort rope, which was simply regular rope he had soaked in wine. His patients likely felt no less pain, but at least they got a pleasant buzz from sucking on wine-soaked rope during the operation. Another surgeon in Germany carved small handles into his wooden bite sticks, like some sort of medieval stress ball for your mouth. He even began taking custom orders, adding decorative carvings for his wealthier patients. Medieval medicine's initial foray into luxury branding. But the real innovation in medieval pain management came from what I term the knockout artists. These were surgeons who recognized that an unconscious patient was a quiet patient. Their method was straightforward. Punch the patient in the head hard enough to render them unconscious. That was the entirety of the technique. No complex medications, no meticulous calculations. Just good old-fashioned blunt force trauma. A medical manuscript from 1382 actually lists strong right hook as an essential surgical skill. The strength of the surgeon became unexpectedly crucial. Some hospitals actually employed what they called quieting assistants, essentially large, strong men whose sole job was to render patients unconscious. This was likely the only instance in medical history where the ability to punch hard was a legitimate job interview criterion. One famous surgeon in England was known for his gentle touch during operations, but his formidable fist beforehand. Talk about a peculiar job recommendation. There's even a record of a monastery specifically recruiting former blacksmiths as surgical assistants due to their reliable knockout capabilities. Of course, this method had its drawbacks. Sometimes patients remained unconscious far longer than intended. Others awoke mid-surgery, which was detrimental to everyone involved. Records detail one particularly unfortunate case where a patient awoke, panicked, and headbutted the surgeon, resulting in both needing medical attention. This was likely the first and only time in history a patient and doctor simultaneously knocked each other out. The hospital's solution? They mandated surgeons wear helmets during operations. Safety first, medieval style. The worst aspect is that some surgeons genuinely believed that the harder they struck a patient, the less pain they would experience during surgery. This led to what one medieval medical text delicately termed excessive quieting, a euphemism for sometimes hitting people so hard it caused serious injury. One surgeon proudly recorded that none of his patients ever complained during surgery, although he neglected to mention this was likely because most had concussions. Another authored a treatise on the perfect quieting force, essentially a medieval dissertation on rendering people unconscious with punches without accidentally killing them. By the late medieval period, some doctors began questioning whether punching patients was truly the optimal approach to surgery. A few even suggested that perhaps, just perhaps, there might be more effective ways to manage pain than assault. This radical thinking led some surgeons to experiment with a new pain management technique, making their patients completely intoxicated. After all, if you can't freeze them or knock them out, you might as well help them drink their troubles away. Medieval surgeons had a fondness for alcohol almost as strong as their affection for saws and knives. The rule was simple. The more severe the surgery, the more alcohol was required. Extracting a tooth? That merits a pint of ale. Losing a leg? Better consume the entire barrel. Records from London Hospital in 1340 show they spent more on wine for patients than on actual medical supplies. That's right, their alcohol budget surpassed their bandage budget. One surgeon even wrote that his hospital consumed approximately 50 barrels of wine per month solely for pre-surgical treatment. And this wasn't your refined contemporary wine. We're talking about potent stuff capable of stripping paint from walls. A monastery record indicates they used the same wine for surgeries and cleaning their floors. Talk about multi-purpose medicine. The patients weren't the only ones partaking. Most surgeons operated while completely inebriated. They claimed it helped steady their hands, which makes as much sense as saying a blindfold improves vision. There's a remarkable complaint letter from 1387 where a patient wrote, "The surgeon was so drunk he tried to amputate my left leg 3 times before someone told him it was my right leg that needed removing." Talk about a lack of attention to detail. Another surgeon gained fame for singing drinking songs during operations. His patients reportedly implored him to simply hum instead. Here's a sample medieval surgical preparation list I found. 1 saw, 2 knives, 3 barrels of wine. At least they were prepared, right? However, they completely failed to understand how alcohol actually functions. These medieval doctors believed drinking would alleviate pain, but anyone who has ever stubbed a toe while intoxicated knows this isn't true. Alcohol thins blood, meaning their drunk patients became essentially human fountains during surgery. The medieval operating room was like a very peculiar tavern. Drunk doctors, drunk patients, and likely drunk spectators, as surgery was a form of entertainment then. Remember, sometimes they even had drinking games happening during the operation. There's a record of one surgeon who would take a shot every time his patient screamed. Needless to say, his success rate wasn't high. Another hospital had what they called a courage corner, where nervous patients could drink themselves brave before surgery. Some hospitals attempted to create recommended drinking guidelines for surgery. These make for amusing reading today. One suggested taller patients should drink more because the wine needed to reach further. Another recommended different alcohol types for different surgeries. Beer for minor cuts, wine for broken bones, and strong spirits for amputations. It was like a medieval cocktail menu, but with more screaming. One particularly detailed guide even specified that red-haired patients should drink more because they were naturally more resistant to wine's effects. Medieval medical science at its finest. Wealthy patients naturally received the superior alcohol. Impoverished individuals had to settle for whatever cheap ale was available. One surgeon even kept a chart indicating which type of alcohol corresponded to which social class. It read something like nobles, finest French wine, merchants, local wine, peasants, whatever's left in the barrel from last week. Medieval healthcare at its most equitable. Some affluent patients even brought their own wine to surgery, treating it like some sort of nightmarish BYOB party. But the absolute best part was their solution. When a patient had too much to drink before surgery, instead of waiting for them to sober up, they simply administered more alcohol. Their logic: if you're already drunk, you might as well be drunk enough to pass out. There's a case from 1392 where a patient was so intoxicated before surgery, he tried to perform it himself. The surgeon's solution? Give him more wine until he can't hold the knife. As more patients began dying from blood loss, some doctors experimented with alternatives. They began exploring various herbs and plants that might induce unconsciousness without turning patients into ambulatory wine barrels. Of course, these experiments came with their own challenges, like determining which plants induced sleep and which induced eternal rest. These weren't your typical garden variety plants. We're discussing seriously potent substances. Mandrake root, henbane, opium, and deadly nightshade constituted their sleep or else collection. It was essentially a medieval chemistry experiment where the test subjects were very unlucky patients. Getting the dosage correct was like attempting to juggle flaming torches while riding a horse backward. Technically feasible, but likely to end poorly. According to a 1356 medical text, approximately 1 in 3 patients given these herbal concoctions either remained awake and felt everything, or fell asleep and never reawakened. Those are not the odds one desires before surgery. The most alarming aspect? Some doctors actually boasted about these figures, claiming they represented superior survival rates compared to the competition. The sleep sponge was their most notable invention. Take a standard sponge, saturate it in a mixture of opium, mandrake juice, and any other dubious plants you could find, then press it against the patient's face until they lose consciousness. One surgeon proudly wrote about his special recipe, which included 17 secret herbs, making him essentially the medieval Colonel Sanders of knockout drugs. The only difference, his secret recipe had a considerably higher death rate. He even attempted to franchise his method to other hospitals, but most declined upon realizing how many patients were not recovering consciousness. Some doctors got remarkably creative with their herb combinations. There's a record of a surgeon who mixed his herbs based on the patient's zodiac sign. If you were a Taurus, you received extra mandrake because apparently bulls required stronger sedatives. Geminis received a double dose, as 2 personalities needed twice the herbs. This individual likely should have spent less time studying constellations and more time studying medicine. He kept meticulous records of which star signs survived best. Spoiler alert, being an Aries didn't improve your chances. Here's a statistic for you. In one medieval hospital, they consumed enough opium in a year to incapacitate a small army. Literally, they actually had to stop treating soldiers because they ran out of drugs. The hospital's record keeper noted, "Use the last of the sleeping herbs on Baker with a toothache. Must turn away knights with arrows in their chest. Poor planning." They eventually began cultivating their own herbs in the hospital garden, which led to interesting situations when local children repeatedly attempted to steal their medicinal plants. Wealthier patients predictably received the premium ingredients. They had their own artisanal herb mixtures, meticulously measured and blended with expensive spices to mask the taste. Impoverished individuals had to make do with what one honest surgeon termed, "whatever weeds we found growing behind the hospital." Sometimes these weeds proved more effective than the elaborate mixtures, which perhaps speaks more about medieval medicine than anything else. Hallucinations were a common side effect. Patients would awaken claiming they had seen angels, demons, or deceased relatives playing cards. One individual was convinced he had spent his entire surgery having tea with the King of France. The surgeons typically just nodded along. After all, it was preferable to patients waking up screaming about the actual surgical procedure. Some doctors even began documenting the most interesting hallucinations, transforming their medical records into something akin to a dream journal. The most amusing reports come from a hospital in Germany, where they attempted to standardize their herbal mixtures. They developed what they called sleep grades, ranging from gentle nap to probably still breathing. The middle grade was labeled talkative but won't remember, which apparently meant patients would babble nonsense throughout the entire operation. One surgeon kept a journal of his favorite patient ramblings, including a merchant who spent his entire surgery trying to sell imaginary geese to the ceiling. Another patient reportedly gave a 3-hour lecture on proper turnip farming while undergoing leg amputation. But it's worse when some of these herbs were so potent that they not only knocked out patients, but also affected anyone standing too close. Numerous accounts exist of assistants passing out during surgery because they were too near the sleep sponge. One hospital had to resort to tying his surgeons to poles to keep them upright. Medieval workplace safety at its finest. They even implemented a rotation system, swapping out assistants every few minutes to prevent the entire surgical team from collapsing. The truly desperate patients would sometimes attempt to acquire these herbs before surgery and take extra, believing more was better. This rarely ended well. A record from 1375 describes a man who stole an entire bag of sleep herbs the night before his surgery. Patient arrived unconscious, saved us the trouble of knocking him out. Unfortunately, he also turned blue, had to postpone surgery to figure out if I was still alive. Another patient consumed so many mandrake roots that he slept through his own surgery, the recovery, and his neighbor's funeral 3 days later. As surgeons ran out of patients, either dying from herbs or remaining annoyingly conscious during operations, they began focusing on a different approach. If they couldn't effectively render patients unconscious, perhaps they could perform the surgery with extreme speed. The fastest surgeons became like medieval rock stars. They had followers, admirer clubs, and likely would have had their own reality television shows if television had existed. These individuals weren't merely medical practitioners, they were the Formula One drivers of the operating theater, complete with their own highlight reels and medical textbooks. Robert Lawn was the champion of speed surgery. This Scottish surgeon could remove a leg in 28 seconds flat, less time than it takes to microwave a snack. He was so rapid that his assistant couldn't keep up, causing a problem when Lawn accidentally severed 3 of the poor guy's fingers during a particularly swift amputation. But wait, it gets even more unbelievable. He was moving so fast that he also managed to slash a spectator's coat. The assistant and spectator both died later from infections, making this likely the only surgery in history with a 300% mortality rate. The patient also died, but at least he died quickly. Speed records became highly important. The hospitals actually tracked their surgeons' best times, as if running a twisted sports league. In today's standings, Dr. William takes the lead with a 45-second leg removal, while Dr. James drops to second place after spending an embarrassing full minute on a simple arm amputation. The competition was so intense that some surgeons hired individuals to time their operations with hourglasses. One hospital even installed a gigantic clock in their operating theater, though they had to remove it after surgeons were constantly distracted trying to beat their personal best times. The average amputation in a London hospital in 1840 took about 2 to 3 minutes, but some ambitious surgeons claimed they could complete it in under 30 seconds. One French surgeon even advertised guaranteed amputation in 25 seconds or your money back. Though honestly, if you died from blood loss, getting your money back was likely not your primary concern. Another surgeon offered a buy one, get one free deal on quick amputations, a seemingly terrible marketing strategy for a doctor. These speed-obsessed individuals didn't just use saws. Sometimes they employed the chisel and hammer method. That's right. They would literally smash through bone as if renovating a house. One surgeon's toolkit included a hammer he had borrowed from his local blacksmith. Patients would awaken to find their legs gone and what appeared to be carpentry tools covered in blood nearby. Talk about a do-it-yourself nightmare. Some surgeons even started assessing their patients' bones on a hardness scale to boast about how quickly they could chisel through them. The operating theaters became like medieval sports arenas. People would place bets on how quickly the surgeon could finish. 10 shillings says he does it in under a minute. 20 shillings says the patient passes out before the leg comes off. Some surgeons even developed signature moves, like Lawn's famous flourish, where he would hold up the amputated limb like a trophy while the audience cheered. It was essentially the medieval equivalent of a touchdown dance. There's even a record of one surgeon who hired a town crier to announce his operation times in the town square. Some surgeons began training like athletes. Fast surgeons became so popular they started receiving special requests. Could you remove my uncle's leg before his soup gets cold? Or, I need this done before the church bells ring. One surgeon actually advertised operations performed between prayers. You won't miss a single hymn. Talk about efficient religious time management. Some patients even began requesting specific speeds, like ordering their steak rare or well done. But the absolute best development was the emergence of surgical showmen. These individuals would dress in special outfits, complete with decorated saws and custom blood-proof aprons. They would stage entire performances, including pre-surgery speeches and post-operation victory laps around the operating theater. One surgeon even hired a band to play dramatic music during his operations, though they kept getting splattered with blood and had to stop. Another had an assistant whose sole task was to polish his saw between cuts, ensuring it gleamed dramatically in the candlelight. While this speed surgery craze was ongoing, some more rational doctors began considering a different approach. Perhaps instead of racing through the operation, they could focus on controlling bleeding more effectively. That's when someone came up with a brilliant idea involving ropes and knots. The tourniquet trick, as they called it. Although trick makes it sound much more enjoyable than it actually was. Medieval doctors realized that if you compressed a limb firmly enough with a rope or belt, it would cut off blood flow and reduce pain. It was their version of a magic trick, but instead of pulling a rabbit from a hat, they were attempting to prevent their patients from bleeding to death. The first tourniquets were quite rudimentary, simply a piece of rope or a leather strap wrapped around the limb. But some doctors made them more elaborate. One individual invented what he termed the perfect pressure device, which was merely a stick tied to a rope that he would twist until blood flow ceased. He was immensely proud of this invention, even though it was essentially the same concept as wringing out wet laundry, but applied to human limbs. He even attempted to patent it, but the medieval patent office rejected his application because, well, it was just a stick tied to a rope. Here's a remarkable statistic for you. Records from one military hospital show they used approximately 200 feet of rope per month just for tourniquets. That's longer than a medieval castle. They went through so much rope that local merchants began selling special surgical rope at triple the normal price. It was the exact same rope sold to farmers, but with a more elaborate name and a significantly higher price tag. One merchant even started dyeing the rope different colors, claiming certain colors worked better for different types of surgeries. Timing was critical. Leaving the tourniquet on for too long would cause tissue to die. Leaving it too loose would render it ineffective. Some surgeons actually used hourglasses to time how long they left the tourniquet applied, leading to some interesting situations. There's a record of one doctor who became so engrossed in his hourglass that he forgot about the actual surgery. But it gets really interesting. Some medieval doctors genuinely believed pain was beneficial for healing. They thought that if you weren't suffering, you weren't getting better. These individuals would deliberately leave the tourniquet loose enough for patients to still experience everything. One surgeon wrote in his diary, "Patient complained about pain during surgery. Excellent, should heal perfectly. Medieval medical logic at its finest." Some even developed a pain scale based on how loudly their patients screamed. Wealthier patients, predictably, received the premium materials. Instead of standard rope, they were provided with silk tourniquets, sometimes adorned with gold thread. Because nothing quite screams, "I'm rich," like having a fancy rope restricting your blood circulation. One nobleman reportedly requested his tourniquet be made from the same silk as his favorite doublet. Talk about coordinating your medical equipment with your outfit. Another affluent patient insisted on having his tourniquets perfumed as he couldn't tolerate the smell of regular rope, as if that would be his primary concern during surgery. During operations, some surgeons developed their own specific tourniquet techniques. One individual claimed he could determine the exact tightness needed for the tourniquet simply by observing the patient's face. His secret? He would continue tightening it until they lost consciousness. Not precisely scientific, but at least his patients weren't awake to protest. He even authored a guide titled "The Art of the Perfect Squeeze," which likely wouldn't pass modern medical peer review. The best part was the assistant problem. Maintaining constant pressure on a tourniquet was arduous work, so surgeons often assign this task to their assistants. These unfortunate individuals would stand for hours, maintaining the exact same pressure. One hospital record mentions an assistant who became so fatigued during a prolonged surgery that he fell asleep standing up, still holding the tourniquet. Training new surgeons to use tourniquets properly was an adventure in itself. They would practice on each other, leading to some rather amusing situations. One medical school had to institute a rule prohibiting students from practicing tourniquets before important exams. as too many were showing up with numb limbs and failing their tests. There's even a record of a student who became so proficient at applying tourniquets that he started offering his services at parties. Medieval medical students had peculiar hobbies. The truly dedicated doctors carried their special tourniquet equipment everywhere. One surgeon had a custom-made belt that could double as a tourniquet in emergencies. He was very proud of this until he actually attempted to use his own belt during an emergency surgery, and his trousers fell down in front of the entire operating theater. After this embarrassing incident, he invented what he called the emergency backup belt, simply another belt. Revolutionary. As hospitals filled with patients suffering from gangrene due to tourniquets being left on for too long, doctors began searching for ways to make surgeries less painful without completely cutting off circulation. That's when they conceived another brilliant idea. Perhaps if they couldn't see the patient screaming, the operation would be easier. And thus began the era of the screaming rooms. Medieval surgery patients were the original tenants from hell. Hospitals actually designated special screaming rooms for surgeries, essentially soundproof chambers where patients could yell at the top of their lungs without disturbing others. It was like a medieval recording studio, but instead of producing music, people were making sounds that would haunt your nightmares. A hospital record from 1362 indicates they spent more on soundproofing their surgery rooms than on actual medical equipment. They insulated the walls with wool, hay, and whatever else they could find to muffle the screams. One hospital even hired a professional wall stuffer who normally worked in castles. His job title, Master of Quieting. Probably the most bizarre job title in medieval history. His resume must have been interesting. Professional experience includes ensuring the king cannot hear peasants complaining and preventing surgery patients from terrifying the entire town. Music also became a significant element in operating rooms. If you couldn't stop the screaming, you could at least attempt to drown it out. Wealthy patients had entire bands playing during their surgeries. Impoverished individuals had to settle for a single musician playing a drum poorly. One surgeon hired a group of monks to chant during operations, believing it made him appear more professional. The monks resigned after a week, unable to chant loudly enough to overpower the screaming. He then tried hiring a group of local drunkards instead, figuring their loud singing would do the trick. Surprisingly, this proved more effective than the monks. The truly elaborate hospitals had different music for different surgeries. Leg amputation? That requires a full orchestra. Tooth extraction? Just a flautist. One hospital even had a price list. Basic surgery, one drummer. Complex surgery, 3 musicians. Royal surgery, entire choir plus bells, because nothing quite says high-class medical care like a full choir observing your surgery. They even commissioned special songs for different procedures. The amputation allegro was particularly popular. Some surgeons took the whole distraction concept to odd extremes. Records show one doctor who would make animal noises during operations. He believed this would confuse patients enough to distract them from the pain. Patients seemed less concerned with amputation once the doctor started mooing like a cow, reads one report. Another surgeon trained his entire staff to bark like dogs during particularly painful procedures. Medieval hospitals must have sounded like very noisy, very disturbing farms. One doctor even specialized in chicken impressions, claiming nobody could scream while trying to understand why their surgeon was clucking. The statistics are hilarious. One hospital reported using up to 50 sets of drumsticks per month because their drummers kept breaking them while trying to play louder than the patient's screams. Another spent more on musician fees than on bandages. A London hospital in 1375 actually employed more musicians than doctors. Their reasoning: music is cheaper than medicine, and patients complain less when they can't hear themselves scream. They even had a musician on call schedule, just like doctors today. But not all attempts at sound masking were successful. One surgeon tried using bells to drown out the noise, but the constant ringing drove his assistants mad. They started showing up to work wearing wool in their ears, which meant they couldn't hear his instructions either. After 3 botched surgeries where the assistant couldn't hear which leg to hold down, they switched back to drums. The bells were repurposed into what they called a patient alert system, basically an early medieval version of a hospital PA system. The award for worst idea goes to the hospital that attempted to use the town crier to outshout their patients. They stationed him outside the surgery room with instructions to yell news and announcements whenever someone started screaming. This worked fine until he began announcing details of the actual surgeries. Some patients developed quite a reputation for their screaming abilities. One individual's yells were so impressive that people would gather outside the hospital simply to listen. The surgeon actually began charging admission. Medieval entertainment was certainly unusual. Another patient screamed so loudly during his surgery that the local church believed it was hearing banshees and organized an exorcism. The priest who arrived took one look inside the surgery room and concluded that the demons likely had a good reason for screaming. While dealing with screaming patients was difficult, the real problem arose when hospitals tried different methods to keep their patients quiet. Staff would attempt various tactics, telling jokes, making faces, even promising rewards for remaining silent. One doctor gained fame for his surgical stand-up routine, where he would deliver terrible jokes during operations. His patients still screamed, but now it might have been due to the bad puns rather than the pain. "Why did the leg cross the road? Because I just amputated it," was reportedly one of his favorites. As medieval doctors ran out of ideas for managing noisy patients, some began exploring a new direction, attempting to distract patients with increasingly bizarre methods. After all, if you couldn't silence them, perhaps you could at least get them to focus on something other than the saw cutting through their leg. Medieval surgeons were essentially the world's worst party planners, constantly devising new ways to keep their patients entertained during operations. Their distraction tactics range from mildly clever to utterly absurd. Take Dr. William of York, who spent more time practicing his jokes than his actual surgical skills. His most famous line, "What's the difference between a successful surgery and a failed one?" About 6 feet. The patients didn't laugh, but the gravedigger certainly did. He kept a journal of all his surgical jokes, likely the only medical text in history intended to be humorous. Some surgeons adopted the conversation approach, chatting about anything and everything while they worked. According to hospital records from 1368, one doctor would inquire about patients' family trees during surgery. By the time he finished an amputation, he would know your entire family history, back to your great-great-grandmother's pet goat. He actually maintained all these family records and became the town's unofficial genealogist. People would visit him for both surgery and family research. Talk about a side hustle. He even began charging extra for premium family history packages during longer operations. The slapping technique was particularly favored by less creative doctors. Their theory was simple. If you slap a patient's face, they will focus on that pain instead of the surgery. One surgeon became known as the Slapper of Surrey because he would give his patients a quick smack every time they began screaming. His success rate wasn't great, but his hand-eye coordination was remarkable. Records show he could slap a patient and saw through a bone simultaneously, a skill that absolutely nobody needed. He even trained his apprentices in the art of therapeutic slapping, which must have been the strangest medical training ever recorded. A hospital in France hired professional storytellers to work during surgeries. These were not just any stories, they were specifically selected to be as inappropriate as possible. The theory was that if you tell someone a dirty joke while amputating their leg, they will be too embarrassed to scream. One particularly famous storyteller, Jean the Questionable, had a collection of tales so scandalous that several patients reportedly forgot they were being operated on because they were too busy blushing. The hospital actually had to create a special position called Master of Inappropriate Tales, probably the only job title in history that improved with one's lack of decorum. In one medieval hospital, 30% of their operating budget was allocated to what they termed distraction supplies. This included items ranging from juggling balls to live chickens. They had a resident juggler on staff who also served as a nurse. Unfortunately, he frequently dropped things during surgery, which likely didn't inspire much patient confidence. Don't worry, he only drops the juggling balls, not the surgical tools, usually. The hospital's annual budget listed emergency juggling equipment as a major expense, right alongside bandages and saw sharpening. The most ambitious surgeon was likely Dr. Henry of Bath, who attempted to create what he called a complete sensory experience. He would have someone playing music, another person waving fragrant herbs around, a third telling jokes, and a fourth showing the patient various interesting objects. The result? Total chaos. His operating room resembled a medieval circus gone wrong. One patient described it as being murdered in the middle of a festival. Dr. Henry eventually scaled back his entertainment plans after several of his assistants quit, claiming they would rather work in an actual circus. Some doctors adopted a psychological approach. They would describe the surgical procedure in such tedious detail that patients would almost succumb to sleep from sheer boredom. One surgeon would explain the technical specifics of his tools in excruciating detail. This saw was forged by Thomas the blacksmith on a Tuesday afternoon, using iron from the mines near Winchester. By the time he reached the actual surgery, most patients were either asleep or begging him to just proceed to stop the lecture. He authored a book titled The Complete History of Surgical Tools that was so dull, it was actually prescribed as a sleeping aid. The award for most creative distraction goes to a London surgeon who hired a professional mime to perform during surgeries. Yes, a mime in an operating room during amputations. The mime would act out what was happening, but in a humorous way. Patients reportedly didn't know whether to scream from pain or laugh at the mime pretending to saw off his own leg. The mime resigned after a month, claiming the job was too weird. And when a medieval mime declares something is too strange, you know it's bad. However, perhaps the strangest distraction method was the future prediction technique. During surgery, doctors would pretend to read patients' palms and invent elaborate predictions about their future. "I see you living a long life with 2 legs instead of 3. It was utter nonsense, but it kept patients focused on their supposed future rather than their current dismemberment. One surgeon became so immersed in this practice that he actually became a legitimate fortune teller after retiring from surgery, probably because predicting the future was easier than keeping patients alive. All these bizarre distraction methods began making hospitals resemble entertainment venues more than medical facilities. Some doctors started questioning if perhaps they were focusing too much on the performance and not enough on the actual medicine. When one surgeon caught his assistant practicing juggling instead of sterilizing instruments, not that they truly understood the sterilization, he realized things had gone too far. Perhaps it was time to try something simpler, like improving surgical techniques. Medieval surgeons weren't born experts at amputation, so how did they become so proficient? Let's just say their practice methods were the stuff of nightmares.